My name's Ranald, and I'm going to tell you the story of the Battle of Culloden. It was a battle fought between a Jacobite army under Prince Charles Edward Stuart, known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and a British government army under Prince William, the Duke of Cumberland. It was the last major battle fought on British soil, and it was fought here, on this ground, on the 16th of April, 1746. Why was a battle fought here? Well, in essence, this was about who should be king of Great Britain. The Jacobites believed that James III was the rightful king. And in fact, the name Jacobites comes from the word Jacob, which means James in Latin. James III was in exile in France, and his son, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, he'd landed in July 1745 on the west coast of Scotland to seize the throne back for his father. He'd only landed with 7 men and a few arms and a bit of money, but he managed to rally some of the Highland clans to his support, and then in a remarkable series of events, he seized Edinburgh, defeated a government army at Prestonpans, and then marched south towards London. However, Jacobite support in England was lukewarm, and faced with superior government forces, the Jacobite army withdrew back towards Scotland. And by April 1746, they were concentrated in the north of Scotland, trying to consolidate the support to renew their campaign in the spring. We're now at the Jacobite front line, marked by these blue flags. The Jacobite army was about just over 6,000 strong, and it formed up here in 2 lines. The front line had the Highland clans, the key fighting element of the Jacobite army, here where we are now. There was about a dozen cannon spread across the front line. But this was an army that was tired and it was hungry. The night before, they tried to launch a surprise attack on the government army, but in the fog and in the rain and over the difficult ground, they became separated and the attack was called off. And they fell back to here, to Culloden Moor, and formed up to face Cumberland's army, which was forming up about 500 metres away, where the red flags are. The government army supported George II, who was the incumbent king of the British throne. His family, the House of Hanover, had ruled Britain for over 30 years, and they'd faced and defeated Jacobite rebellions in the past, in 1715 and in 1719. The Duke of Cumberland was his youngest son, and his army was tasked with finding and defeating the Jacobite army in battle before then clearing the rest of the Highlands from Jacobite support. So, the stakes were high. The outcome of this battle was going to decide who was going to be king of Great Britain. After some skirmishing on the Jacobite right flank, the Jacobite cannon opened fire at about 1 o'clock. Now, this fire won't win the battle for the Jacobites. It's designed to soften up the government front line. The key tactic that the Jacobites are going to use is a Highland charge across this moorland. The Highland charge had worked at Prestonpans, it had defeated the government army at Falkirk, and the plan was it was going to defeat Cumberland's army here at Culloden. Prince Charlie rides along the front of the Jacobite lines to bolster morale. He has some French troops fighting for him, and he stops in front of a French officer that he knows, and he asks the officer how he thinks the battle will go. The officer pauses, looks across to the government lines, and he says, "Your Highness, I think the battle will be lost, because never have I seen an army deploy in such a cool and regular manner as Cumberland's army." The government cannon soon replied to the Jacobite fire, and they're much more effective. Jacobite cannon are knocked out. Then they switch the fire onto the Jacobite infantry. And the Jacobite front line, the Highland clans, they start to take casualties to this fire. And it's clear that they're either going to break or they're going to have to be given the order to advance. And that's what happens. Prince Charlie gives them the order to advance and to charge the government lines. We're on the Jacobite right flank with the Atholl men in the lead. On their left are the Camerons and the Stuarts. They leap over the walls of this enclosure. Some of the Highlanders take their muskets and loose off around towards the government forces. But we're about 250 metres away, really not effective musket range. They throw down their muskets, they don't take the time to reload them, and they draw their swords, ready to deliver the Highland charge. Onwards! Ah! The Highlanders close in to the government front line to deliver their charge. But what's it like to be a government soldier? How do you face a Highland charge without running away? Meet Fusilier Sharon of the government army, and she's been trained how not to run away when faced with the Highland charge. She's armed with a musket, and at the end of the musket we've got a pointy bayonet. Now, rather than worrying about the Highlander that's charging directly at her, she's been trained to point this bayonet towards the Highlander on her right. Let me demonstrate. Got the Highlander coming in, ready to hack the man to Sharon's right, but as he raises her arm, she thrusts her bayonet forward and stabs that Highlander on the vulnerable right flank. So what happens when that Highland charge hits home? The main force is on the Jacobite right. It hits the 1,000 men at the government front line of Barrow's regiment, Monroe's regiment and the Royal Scots Fusiliers. Private Alexander Taylor, he talks about the Jacobites coming towards them like hungry wolves. Government cannon are still firing at this stage, and they're firing a round called grape shot. This is like a giant canister, and they fire it at close range. Leading the Camerons is Donald Cameron of Lochiel, and he's scythed down by canister fire when he's a mere pistol shot away. In revenge, Camerons get in amongst the guns and they hack down Sergeant Bristol and 2 of his detachment, and they die of their wounds later on at the end of the battle. The government's bayonet tactics mean they have the confidence not to run away. However, they come under increasing pressure on their left flank. Barrow's regiment is faced off not just with the Atholl men, but with Camerons and with Stuarts as well. They begin to break through and they start to head for the government regiment colours, those flags which keep soldiers on the battlefield. The commanding officer of Barrow's regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Rich, he goes to defend the colours. He draws his sword. He puts his hand on the colours in their defence. But the colours are grabbed off him and his hand is cleaved off by a Highlander. Seeing their colours go, Barrow's regiment starts to waver. They've taken 135 casualties, over 30%, and they're under real pressure. However, 4 regiments are moved up from the government reserve, and they form an arc round the Camerons and Stuarts that have broken through, and they subject them to a crossfire, causing up to 700 casualties. The Jacobite advance stalls on the right flank. Lord George Murray has been the Jacobite commander in this area. He's been involved in the thick of the fighting, but he sees that the Jacobites, they now need to bring up some reserves. and he pulls back to see who's available. Sadly for the Jacobites, they don't have many troops in reserve. On the Jacobite left, the charge hasn't really got going. The ground is more boggy. One Highlander talks about being up to his middle legs in water, and he can scarcely walk, let alone charge over that ground. Without reserves, the Highland charge loses its impetus, and it breaks and it fails, and the Jacobite army begins to withdraw. The government unleash their cavalry, and that withdrawal turns into a rout. The battle is clearly lost for the Jacobites. With the battle clearly won, Cumberland orders his army to advance, and no quarter is given. Wounded Highlanders are killed where they lay. The government cavalry pursue all the way to Inverness, but some high-profile Jacobites are captured. Lord Kilmarnock, one of the Jacobite commanders, mistakes government cavalry for friendly Jacobite cavalry, and he's captured. He's a proud man, he's an iron man, and he's filled with shame. He's led past the regimental colours of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, a government regiment, and when he sees their colours with the saltire and the thistle, tears start to run down his face. One officer steps forward from that government regiment, and he covers Kilmarnock's face with his hat. That officer is Lord James Boyd, and he's the son of Lord Kilmarnock. The casualties, about 300 on the government side, and perhaps 1,500 on the Jacobite side. The loss of the battle breaks Jacobite resistance, and Prince Charlie, he goes on the run, pursued across the Highlands. The Duke of Cumberland orders the harrying of the Highlands to ensure there'll be no Jacobite rebellions in the future. But those are stories for another time.